A really quick video that walks you through the digital trainer that we're going to use in the labs. So first of all, this is a powered device, so you get it out of the cabinets and you plug it in, and then one of the things we have come up is you've got to remember to turn it on. Okay, the next thing is, and we'll talk about this in a second, all the chips that we're going to use for this first lab, we're going to wire up a simple digital logic circuit, but all the chips need 5 volts for power, and then they also need ground connections. And so on the digital trainer here to the left, you can find the 5 volt and power connection points. The next thing we need to talk about, we're not going to use a lot of the features on these trainers. We're just going to use the slide switches for inputs and the LEDs for outputs. All right, so one way to think of this, the internal circuitry for the switches, is that it's a double throw switch, meaning it takes 2 positions. It can be connected here, or it could be connected, let me make that a little wider. It can be connected in this position, or it can be moved down into this position. Okay, so there's single pole 2 positions that can land in. All right, so if it's landed in this lower position, you can see you have a place that you can connect to, this dot here, and there'd be your wire coming out of the switch that corresponds to these locations on the digital trainer. So if you want to wire up switch A, you just make a wire connection into that hole and move that to your breadboard. All right, then if you move the switch to the upper position, you'll see it's connected to, the 5 volts doesn't show on this diagram, but it's connected to 5 volts through a resistor. Well, we're not going to get into the details of why that resistor needs to be there. But the point is there's a connection to 5 volts when the switch is in the upper position. Okay, so we use those for controlling the inputs for our circuit. The next thing we need to talk about are the LED outputs. And by the way, this resistor is internal to the board. You don't see it. So you don't have to wire any resistor into this. It's already there. Okay. Next, I want to talk about the outputs. All right, the output LEDs. All right, so here's a closer up view of that. And the first diagram here shows the physical layout. It corresponds to the physical layout where we have a connection point right here, and then we have a resistor that's showing up right here. And so you can see that here. And then we have the light emitting diodes that are grounded. Okay, so normally ground is at the bottom of the circuit, so we have this flipped over so you can see it. And so you would connect at this point. These are these connection points at the bottom. And then when you get a 5 volts output from your digital circuit, it should light up the LED. Okay, the resistors you can see those. If those weren't there, this one's easier to explain. If those weren't there, you would overload the LEDs and burn them out. Okay, but they're already there, so you don't have to worry about it. It's pretty simple to make these connections with the digital trainer. Okay, so before I move on, I have another thing I want to discuss that gives you some of the basics of a breadboard. I think you know this from your experiences in Engineering 1301 and 1302, but let's review it. All the holes marked by, let's start right here on the left side. All the holes marked by bus lines are connected. Okay, so the red strip right here and the blue strip right here, those are all connected. Whether the red is power or ground, it depends on what you connect it to. All right, so typically we use the red line. I use the red line for plus 5 volts, and I would use the blue line for ground. That's just one way you could do that. The next thing to notice is that there's a gap here. And so if you want to run a power bus across the whole breadboard, you actually need to have a jumper connection. So you would need to put a wire that bridges this gap so that those continue to be connected. You need to do that, of course, on both the plus 5 volts and the ground bus. All right, So hopefully you remember that or have seen that before. Okay, so we've talked about this. All right, next, you need to know the connection points on the breadboard, and it turns out when you have the breadboard oriented the way it's shown in this diagram, the vertical columns are all connected together. So these are all considered the same connection point. Okay, he shows this diagram with lines connecting here, so it's pretty obvious that if you have a wire connected to this point and this point, that's the same thing as having those two wires connected together. Okay, this is like a great big dot. Okay, so that gives you a way to connect several things to a certain point on the board. Okay, so I think you've probably seen that before. All right, so I talked about you need to supply 5 volts and ground. So one of the things you could do is take this connection to the bus and connect that to the little ground hole that shows up on the left-hand side of the digital trainer. And then you could take another wire and connect it here to the plus 5 volt connection point on the digital trainer. You would need to jumper this across like we just talked about. And then you could wire up the power to your integrated circuit. So we have an integrated circuit here, and typically the way these would be numbered in terms of the pin count is you would start, let me get it in red. Here's pin 1, make this bigger, make my pin a little smaller. This is pin 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then you wrap around to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. Okay? Most of the time, most of the pins, or most of the chips that we're going to use, pin 14 is going to be the connection that needs to be made to plus 5 volts. So remember, all these are connected together, so I can make a connection going between here and somewhere on this bus. That would connect that to 5 volts. And then if I want to go pin 7, so I can make a connection in this hole because these are all connected together, and I could connect up here to the ground bus, and I would have this chip wired up correctly. Okay, so I think that covers the basics of the breadboard and of the digital trainer. Hopefully you remember these things from 1301 and 1302, but if you've never seen it before, it's not complicated. Just think it through, and now you know how things are connected.